Hi, it's Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop, and today I want to share with you a really simple but really powerful concept that can change the way that you EQ forever for the better. It is so simple, so easy to learn, and so powerful. Once you put this lens on for EQing, you're going to start to hear this everywhere. And that's because the reality is that there are 4 different frequency shapes that any mix can come in. And really 4 different frequency shapes that any sound can come in. And that means that there are 4 cardinal directions for EQ. Yeah, just 4 ways you can EQ just about any track. I really first started to discover this in mastering. I've been working in audio for more than 2 decades professionally, and I've been mastering for more than a decade professionally. But it wasn't until I had been mastering for years that I discovered this principle, and now I want to hand it to you so you can learn much faster than I did. You see, in the hundreds, or actually thousands of masters that I've done over this past decade, I've discovered that all the mixes I get into master, they all come in just one of 4 different shapes from a frequency perspective. And that means in every single master that I've ever done, there's only 4 basic things that I do to any master from an EQ perspective. And I'll go even further to say that once you figure out which of these 4 basic shapes the mix is in, and have determined which general direction it wants to go, which of these 4 cardinal directions of EQ you should be going in, you have just solved 80 to 90% of the puzzle of EQing that track. I'm going to show this to you in the mastering context, and we're going to hear a whole bunch of audio examples together today to really hammer it home. But the reality is that this concept applies anywhere. If you're recording, if you're producing, if you're mixing, there are really only 4 shapes that the sound can be in relative to where it wants to wind up, and therefore only 4 cardinal directions of EQ. And we're going to explore that in depth right now. Quick shout out and thanks to Relab for this one. They sent me over this Maselec MEA2 EQ to try out, and I've now been using it on all of my masters. This is now part of my preset mastering template. And the reason is, this is an EQ that I actually learned how to EQ on. I can even say that this Maselec MEA2 EQ is the EQ that really taught me how to EQ, especially when it comes to mastering, but it taught me so much about EQ in general. This is the EQ that my mastering mentor, Joe Lambert, showed me how to EQ on when I first started mastering more than a decade ago. And now, very recently, it's available for the first time in plugin form. If you wanted to get one of these EQs in hardware form, it would cost you $8,000 to $10,000, something like that, but the plugin is super affordable, and it's made it into my mastering template now that I bring up on every mastering session. I absolutely love this thing. I love the way it sounds. It sounds just like I remember. It's beautifully matched to the original EQ and has this great blend between being really simple and really flexible at once. This is one of the all-time best mastering EQs out there, and probably one of the most heard EQs in history. This has been in so many mastering rooms around the world, and therefore on so many final commercial releases that you've heard and loved throughout your life. If you want to go deeper with the concept and sounds that we're going to explore together today, I've actually made a whole bunch of presets for this Maselec MEA2 EQ that are right here in the plugin. So if you go to relabdevelopment.com, download the free trial, you can try out these presets to play along with this idea at home or in your own studio. So big shout out and thanks once again to Relab for supporting this channel, helping make this video free to the public, and for sending me this Maselec EQ to try out, and for allowing me to make some presets for it, which was a lot of fun. I actually have a whole walkthrough video on this EQ if you want to hear about it in even more detail. I'll link to that on the screen here and in the comments down below. But for right now, let's get into this concept of the 4 mix shapes, the 4 cardinal directions of EQ, and then we'll start hearing some of these things together. But right before we get into the audio examples, I want to download this idea into your brain. So here are the 4 major mix shapes. Mix shape number 1 is the too dark mix. And mixes that are a little bit too dark, this is the most common way for a mix to come in mastering. Most mixers mix a little bit darker than their master wants to wind up. And most beginning mixers mix a lot darker than the final master wants to end up. A mix that's too dark is one that sounds a little bit veiled, a little bit muddy, murky, indistinct. It doesn't have the clarity and detail and polish and shimmer that you'd expect out of a final master for commercial release. It has maybe an excessive buildup in low mids, but also there might be an excessive buildup in the low frequencies, particularly the sub frequencies. It could be that the mixing engineer didn't have a great listening environment and just wasn't hearing all the sub that was there, and therefore loaded in too much sub frequency, too much 50 and 60 hertz into their record. Or maybe in their listening position, because they were in a poorly treated room, they weren't hearing as much 80 hertz or 100 hertz as there really is, so they end up with a mix that's overly boomy sounding. And on the too dark mix, we might have to make some cuts to the low frequencies as well as the low mids. And we might want to find some frequencies in the upper mids or the high frequencies or both to add some boosts in to get a little bit more detail and clarity out of the mix. I've actually made a mastering preset to deal with this in the Maselec MEA2 EQ called Brighten. And I've got two different versions of it, moderate and significant. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail and hear it in action in just a minute. The second most common mix shape is related to this one, and it's the other most common mix shape. And that is the mix that is too mid-rangey. This is a lot like the mix that's too dark. There might be excessive low mid-range, there might be not enough upper mids or high frequencies. It just sounds a little veiled and clouded and inarticulate, indistinct, and it's just lacking some of the presence and detail and sheen of a professional sounding record. But the big difference between the too mid-rangey mix and the too dark mix is the too mid-rangey mix is also lacking in low frequencies. And this is possibly the easiest kind of mix to deal with at mastering. It just needs a little bit of a lift in the lows and the highs. We might need to find a place to carve out a little bit in the low mids or maybe in the center mids to get rid of some of that muck and murk and congestion. And it might need a little bit of a boost in the upper mids or the high frequencies or maybe a little bit of both. We're kind of giving it that classic smiley face curve, just hyping it up a little bit. And once again, I have a preset here in the Maselec MEA2 called Hype Up that does exactly as advertised. It hypes things up a little bit, gives us a little bit more bombast on the bottom, a little bit more sparkle on the top, adds a little bit of control in the low mid-range, and I have a moderate, subtle version of this and a more significant version of it. So you can go through these and hear which of these cardinal directions of EQ is right for your mix, and will give you a better sense for what shape your mix is already in. These two mix shapes, the too dark mix and the too mid-rangey mix, these are the most common shapes for mixes to come in when they arrive at the mastering studio. And this is okay. They are relatively easy problems to deal with, and often they're not even really problems. They're just a subtle change that we want to make, a slight redirecting of the energy of the mix to just make them sound a little bit more finished, a little bit more professional. I'd say that 70, maybe even 80% of mixes that come into a studio for mastering are this way, just a little bit darker than they want to wind up, or a little bit more mid-rangey than they want to wind up, and this is totally okay. But there are two other shapes that mixes can come in. One of them, and this is probably the most rare shape, but it happens sometimes, is the mix that's just too bright. This is the kind of mix that is lacking some bottom-end foundation. It's lacking some weight in the low end and the low mids, and it maybe just sounds a little bit too thin and tinny overall. Here we want to add some substance and fullness and suppleness to the mix. We're maybe softening the top end a little bit, making it a bit more supple, adding a little bit of weight and heft to the bottom end and to the low mids. And once again, I've got a preset in here to address this called Darken. And every once in a while, I might apply this kind of curve to something that's not excessively bright just starting out, but where the record has an aesthetic where it just wants to go a little bit darker, where it wants to be a little bit more mysterious or a little bit more moody or a little bit swampier feeling. We could take a relatively well-balanced mix, and depending on what the records the client really loves the sound of are like, we might just want to go slightly darker, slightly fuller and beefier sounding. So every once in a while, this will be the appropriate thing to do. This is one of the less common mix curves, but it happens with some frequency. And then the final mix curve. This is a less common one, but it's becoming increasingly more common. When newer mixers start out, their mixes are often very dark or very muddy or very mid-rangey compared to where a final professional commercial release wants to wind up. But at a certain point, producers and mixers start to realize this, so they start to mix a little bit brighter with a little bit more hype. They determine that they love the way their records sound when they come back from mastering, and wouldn't it be great if they could bring some of that feel, some of that flavor, some of that EQ curve into their mixes, and they start doing that. And that's a wonderful thing to do. It's great. Your mixes should sound as finished as possible when you're done with them before they even go to mastering. But almost inevitably, what will happen is as we start to mix a little bit brighter and as we start to hype things up a little bit more, what's the first thing that we often do? We often go a little bit too far with it. And this is where you get mixes that are in this fourth shape, the overly hyped up mix, the mix that is too scooped. So that's our fourth shape. Too scooped. This is a record that's missing some of its mid-range. It's got a whole bunch of bottom end and top end on it, and it might in some ways sound really big and glossy and impressive, but that mid-range is missing. There is a hole in the middle where the heart and soul of the record should be, because that is where the heart and the soul and so much of the texture and personality of a record lives, right there in the mid-range. So with these overly scooped mixes, sometimes we've got to do the opposite of what we've been talking about so far. We've actually got to find places to cut in the low frequencies and the high frequencies, to take some of those excesses in the lows and highs and bring them under control a bit more, to find a spot in the mid-range, maybe the center mids, maybe a little bit of the low mids, and bring those forward a little bit to give the record a little bit more focus, character, grit, heart, soul, and personality. Once again, I've got a preset here in the Maselec MEA2 called More Mids that's meant to deal with exactly this issue. Once you go through this kind of processing, there's a way in which the mix might sound a little bit less impressive. It doesn't have as much bombastic lows and sparkly highs, but you put it on and all of a sudden, the whole song feels better. The instruments that are supposed to be emphasized feel emphasized. Often I'll find this too scooped kind of mix happening on people who are mixing rock records or acoustic records, more organic performed genres, but they've been referencing a lot of EDM or electronic music, and they're a little bit jealous of all those extra lows and highs and some of the hype and bombast that are in those records, and they're starting to emulate that, but maybe they've pushed it just a little bit further than their record should, and that's where this mids-forward approach to mastering can really help and bring some of the heart and soul of the record back in. So those are the four general shapes that a mix can come in. It can be either too dark, too mid-rangey, too bright, or too scooped from where we want to wind up. And whether we're doing a really subtle master where we're just making little half dB and 1 dB changes in EQ, or a really significant master where we're digging in a lot more and making 2 and 3 and maybe even 4 dB changes in EQ, the general concept remains the same. There are only four shapes that mixes come in, and therefore only four basic cardinal directions to take them in from there. In just a second, we'll hear some of these examples together and flip through some of these presets and apply some of these different curves so you can really get a feel for what this kind of thing sounds like. And once you start hearing this kind of thing in mastering, I believe you'll start hearing this everywhere, because this applies not just to mix shapes, but the shape of any instrument in your mix. So if you're recording, producing, mixing, selecting sounds, you can get that sense of what's the overall shape of this sound compared to where it wants to wind up. Maybe it's perfect already and it doesn't need even a touch of EQ. But if it does need some EQ, this is one of the first best questions to ask yourself. First, what, if anything, needs to change? And then where are we now relative to where we want to wind up? And for that, if you think about these four different mixed shapes and the four cardinal directions of EQ, it's going to make your EQing life so much easier. Just by answering this question and solving this problem, you have done 80, maybe 90% of the job of EQing. Getting the big picture right is the number one thing. And from there, the rest is just details. Do the details matter? Yes, always. But they're the 20%, not the 80%. All right, let's hear some of this in action now. I've got a couple of different mixes from a couple of different genres, and we'll go through all of these EQ curves and hear together which of these sound right. If you want to try out these presets for yourself, go over to relabdevelopment.com where you can download and get the free trial for the Maselec MEA2 EQ and flip through these presets yourself on your own mixes to get a sense pretty instantly for which general direction your mix should be going in. All right, now let's hear some audio examples so we can really get into our ear what I'm talking about. I've got tracks from a couple of different genres pulled up here. We'll start with something a little bit more pop and move into something a little bit more rock, and we'll explore a few of these different looks, a few of these different shapes that can be applied to any master. The first track I've got here is from an artist named Karen Bell. This one was produced by the great Josh Dion, and the mix and the production here are really good, but this mix was, like some mixes, a bit dark. And I'm actually going to put on what might be considered slightly more extreme settings on the mastering side of things. It's appropriate when a track is this dark to maybe do cuts and boosts as big as 2, 3, and 4 dB. That's not usually where I want to start when it comes to mastering, but if a mix is good and a track is good, if you have a good sounding EQ like this one, you can make moves this big and the result will sound good. So listening to this track, it definitely fits for me what I would consider the dark profile and maybe even the mid-rangey profile, because I think it needs some low end amped up as well. I'll put on my headphones here and let's hear a before on this track. The only change is EQ.
There's a life within the case, so you don't make that permanent mistake. Don't cry, little girl, pick yourself and fight. Hope hides in dark where you can see the light. To make it out alive. And I don't know if I wanna change my whole view about it. And I don't know if I can look another way. What do my friends say about it? They're impressed, my brother, sister, don't wanna hear what they say. You better rise up. Come on, I get up.
So here we're definitely going in the hyped up direction. I'm cutting significant low mids here around 200, significant center mids around 800, and we're boosting everything above 1K and a little bit down below 60 hertz as well. Now, to make this into a final master, there's still more that would need to be done. I might go for some slightly more subtle settings here and then do a little bit more dynamic range control, lean into things like saturators or tape simulators, but this is a good overall start. These changes from 1 to 2 dB on this track, I'd probably start somewhere around here and then fine-tune things a little bit from here. But getting this right first, the overall shape, knowing which direction to take it in, this is the big thing. We're going from dark on top, cluttered and thick in the mid-range to a lot more open and exciting and clear and bombastic. At times in that last pass, I made the example even more obvious by doing cuts as big as 4 dB and boosts as big as 2 dB, but really somewhere here in the 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5 dB range, that's probably an appropriate place to start. Let's hear a totally different genre here with a rock track, and this one's a little bit better balanced as far as the overall frequency spectrum just going in, and we could take this in a number of different directions. This next track is called I Can't Return by the band Londinium. I've played some of their tracks here on this channel before. One of the band members, a guy named Varun, produced and mixed this stuff and did really good work on it. And for this one, I want to flip through some of the presets I've created here for the Maselec MEA2. Under this preset menu, you'll find I have 4 basic categories. We've got brighten, darken, hype up, and more mids. And for each of those, I've got 2 versions, moderate and significant. For the sake of examples, I'll go into the more significant settings here, where you can see some of the changes are as much as 1, 1.5, even 2.5 dB. And I'm doing some corresponding gain boost here, so it's relatively level matched before and after. Whether or not these before and afters are perfectly level matched on your material is going to depend a little bit on the frequency curve of that particular material, but it's a good starting point. And because this gain knob goes in half dB increments, I have erred ever so slightly on the side of, if in doubt, going slightly louder rather than slightly quieter on the afters. Because as useful and imperfect as level matching is, loud is still more fun, especially when we're doing examples. But it should be pretty close, within a half dB or so. So this time, I kind of just want to flip through the different presets. And because this is a relatively well-balanced mix, we could go in a number of directions. And I'm going to start by taking it in the exact opposite direction that we listened to before. I'm going to start this time by going for this more mids preset. This is a significant version. You can tell that I'm rolling things down above 3K. We're reducing some of that high frequency, upper mid-range, and high frequency. We're doing a little bit of boost in the gritty center mids here around 700, and we're even doing a little bit of a boost in this 500 area, which is a less common thing to do in mastering. And I'm actually taking down the extreme lows a little bit to really give it some focus. And as we're listening through to this before and after, I'll also make some subtle tweaks here. Rather than just boosting around 700 hertz, we can hear what this would sound like boosted around 1K, or with a dip in the low mids at 500 and a big boost at 1K. So let's check this out, this time adding mids to the track. Here's our before. Do you hear how this change, even though it doesn't make it prettier, it makes it a little bit more focused, a little crunchier, and a little bit more rock sounding in a way? This is one of the directions we could go, but it's not the only direction we could go with this master. Here, let's try this one more time, and I'll play around with it, doing slightly different boosts in the mids. Here we go from a more scooped sound to a less scooped sound once again. You hear how, again, this just gets a little bit less polite, a little bit angrier, a little bit crunchier. Now, I might not boost this amount of mids on a record, but I think you get the idea of going from a more scooped in the middle sound to a more mid-forward sound. This is one of the general shapes you really got to learn. The exact opposite of this approach would be going from a more mids version to a hyped up version, where we're going even more in the scoop direction. And this can also sound great on certain types of modern sounding rock records. Let's do this comparison real quick. So here it is first with mids boosted. I can't return to what I had with you. And I think you can hear this one is adding hype. It's just adding bottom, it's adding top. It's cleaning up and tightening those mids a little bit. We're really doing quite a bit of scooping in the low mids for a tighter feel. And we're getting a lot more bite and brightness out of our upper mids and our high frequencies while adding in a little bit more bottom. Now, again, we don't have to go this far on every master. We're making changes here of 2 and 3 dB, but for before and after, I think this kind of listening is going to help tune your ears to the concept I'm talking about. Let's go ahead and push this even harder and then dial it back a little bit too. Here's some quick alterations to the hyped up feel. I can't also a cool sound, and this is a different direction that this record can go in. Which direction we want to go in depends a little bit on what the artist's favorite records actually sound like, what the producer and mixer's favorite records and references really sound like. What's appropriate for this genre, whether we want to push the envelope in one direction or another, and most importantly, where the track started. In a real mastering session, and I believe on Varun's mix, my changes were much more minor than this. I probably was in the half dB and dB ranges, and we probably tried it a couple of different ways. Here's how this thing would sound if we went a little bit more in the hyped direction, and here's how it would sound if we went a little bit in the crunchier, more mid-forward direction. But if you want to train your ears to hear these things, sometimes pushing an EQ too far is a good idea. And on some real releases, sometimes actually pushing the EQ farther than you'd expect in a real master is exactly what you should be doing. Now, the last two basic categories I have here for you are brighten and darken. So with a Brighton EQ profile, we're reducing lows and low mids, and we're boosting high frequencies and upper mids. With this master select, I often like to use these shelving filters to start at a fairly low high frequency boost. So I'm applying a very gentle curve all the way up, but the way the curves are graduated on this is absolutely wonderful. Even if you choose a higher frequency to do your boosts at, it usually starts the boost a little bit lower than that frequency, making for a really gentle and useful tilt. I absolutely love the way this thing responds and how the EQ curves here have been curated. It's no wonder that this EQ has been used on so many of your favorite major records. And I think you can see in some of these examples, I'm pushing it pretty hard in a mastering context, and it still sounds good. All right, let's go through my significant brightening and significant darkening presets so you can get a sense for that. Here's a before with then a brightening EQ applied. And for me, this is not the right EQ curve for this record. As an EQ, it still sounds good, but this record doesn't need the bottom reduced like this. Varun did a good job balancing his low end, and although this is a fairly common thing to do on some mixes that will come in for mastering, I'm not liking this low shelf reduction here. If we were to do a brightening EQ curve on this one, I might leave the low end totally untouched and back off a little bit on this low mid cut as well. But again, this is clearly not the right EQ curve for this record. I think we either want to go in that hype direction or a very subtle version of that mids forward direction we checked out. Let's also check out this master with the darken curve on it. So here we'll go into the significant darken curve, and you can see what this one is doing is boosting low frequencies. We're boosting a little bit of our center mids, and there is a significant cut here in our low highs and upper mids. Now, once we are darkening it this substantially, there is a little bit of a cut in the low mids to keep it from getting too cluttered and too boxy and muddy when we're darkening it. Again, I don't think that this is going to be the right EQ profile for this track, but let's hear it. There are going to be some masters that you get that are really bright, they want some weight added to them, and they want a little bit more smoothness on top. And in those cases, this darkness direction will be the way to go. Here's our before. So I think you can hear on this one is doing a nice thing where it's softening the top end a little bit, but the low end here is just too bulbous, too murky. This darkening direction is not the way to go. Again, Varun had some good, well-balanced low end here. So the two starting points that we could argue between are, do we want to go in the hype up direction or the more mids direction? Let's hear a really modest version of these two very different takes. I'll adjust some of these EQ settings like I did before. And here's a really modest take on the more mids approach. Our before. Not bad. Let's compare that to a more modest take of the hype up preset here. Back off on these considerably. Let's try this out. And I think you can hear, even with just some half dB and 1 dB changes, we can just reshape the overall feel of this track, and either of these could be a great starting point in our mastering chain. To me, there's obviously still more to be done on this, even after we've gotten our basic overall shaping EQ dialed in, but at least we can get this first part of the battle done with. 80% of our mixing is finished right here after we've made these decisions. Which four of these major directions do we want to go in? And then how can we tweak the exact frequency parameters to make sure that we're leaning in the right direction? After this, I'd look into leaning into some of my other tools, perhaps multiband processors like dynamic EQs, things like saturators, tape simulators, limiters, potentially compressors, stereo wideners. There could be other things going on in the chain, but the lion's share of the master happens right here with this kind of beautiful, broad shaping mastering EQ that can be really surgical and really precise, or really reshape things without giving us artifacts or an overly EQ'd sound. I've enjoyed playing around with this EQ. It is now part of my mastering chain on literally every record I do, and I'd say this EQ is now active on probably at least 80% of the masters I now do. I'd recommend you try it out for yourself. Go over to relabdevelopment.com where you can download a trial of this and try out all of my presets here, both a moderate and a significant version of all four of these shapes: brighten, darken, hype up, and more mids. These specific frequencies you settle on and the boosts and cuts you use really are going to depend on the track material, which direction it needs to go in, but I really believe that any of these could be a great starting point for you and at least help answer the question of which direction should I go in. Let me know in the comments down below which of these curves you liked the most on these particular mixes. And when you try out this plugin for free for yourself, let me know which of these presets you find yourself using the most often on your own tracks or the tracks of your clients. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.